The first time I rode into Wishbone Valley, I had no intention of staying, and no intention of being anything but a pair of hands. I had spent 12 years learning to be nobody, and I was good at it by then. I could shoe a horse, dig a post hole, mend a fence, gentle a green colt, and never once give a man reason to remember my face. That was the whole of what I wanted out of the world. A bunk, a meal, honest work that left me too tired to dream, and a name so plain nobody would ever ask me to be more than it. I tell it now because a man ought to be honest about where he started, even if it shames him, and it shames me that I came to that valley meaning to walk on through. If I had, a good woman would have lost everything she had, and her children with her, and I would have ridden the rest of my life never knowing I'd passed by the one thing that could have saved me. It was late in a dry September. I'd come down out of the ladder hills on a borrowed-looking sorrel mare I'd bought honest in Tres Robles, and the heat lay on the valley floor like a hand pressing down. The quartz river ran low and green between its banks, the only living water for 40 miles in any direction, and where the wagon road met it there was a ford, and at the ford there was a crossing, and at the crossing there was a woman standing in the middle of the road with a shotgun broken open over her arm, talking to 3 men on horseback who did not mean her any good. I knew that the way you know weather. I'd spent a long part of my life reading men's intentions off the set of their shoulders, and these 3 sat their horses the way men sit when they've come to make somebody afraid and are enjoying it. The one in front wore a town coat too good for trail work and a hat brushed clean, and he was smiling. The 2 behind him were hired and looked at, lean, watchful, their hands easy near their belts. The woman stood in front of a low log house with a sod-roofed barn beyond it and a corral of horses, and she was not afraid, or if she was she had buried it deep enough that it didn't show, and I admired that before I knew one thing else about her. I had it in my mind to ride on by. I want that set down plain. I checked the mare and meant to take the ford at a walk, mind my own road and be gone. Then the man in the town coat said something I didn't catch, and the woman said, clear enough to carry, "You can tell Mr. Coyne the answer is the same as it was in June and the same as it'll be next June. The Lindley crossing is not for sale. Now get off my road before I close this gun." And the man in the town coat laughed, and one of the hired men nudged his horse forward a step, crowding her, the way you'd crowd a heifer you meant to turn, and that was the thing I couldn't ride past. A man crowding a woman with a horse to make her give ground. I have crossed a great deal in my life that I should not have crossed and let stand, but that one I couldn't. So I rode up out of the ford with the river running off my mare's legs, and I stopped a little apart from them, where a man stops when he wants to be seen and not yet reckoned with, and I touched my hat to the woman like she was the only one there, which as far as I was concerned she was. "Ma'am," I said, "I came down looking for work. Heard at Tres Robles there might be a crossing this way needing a hand before winter. Would that be your place?" It was a lie, and it wasn't. I had heard no such thing, but I'd learned long ago that the surest way to stand between trouble and a person is to give the trouble somewhere else to look, and to give the person a reason to keep you close, and I did both with one sentence, and I saw her take it in. She was quick. Her eyes went over me once, the mare, the bedroll, the way I sat, and whatever she read there she decided to use. "It would," she said, "and I am. You've good timing, mister. My last hand quit on me in August." "Did he?" I said. "He did," she said, and there was a dry edge under it that told me her last hand had not quit so much as been frightened off, and that she knew I'd understand that, and that she was daring me to mind. The man in the town coat had stopped smiling. He turned in his saddle to look at me proper, and I let him, and I kept my hands loose and plain on the horn where he could see them and make nothing of them, because there was nothing yet to make. "This is private business," he said, "between Mrs. Lindley and her landlord's interests. It don't concern a drifter." "No, sir, it surely doesn't," I agreed, easy as you like. "I'm just here about the work." And I looked back to the woman as if the man had blown away on the wind. "Whatever you're paying, ma'am, I'll take it, and I'll start by getting these horses watered. They've come away." It was nothing. It was the least thing a man could do, to pretend 3 armed men weren't there. But I have learned that contempt costs a bully more than a fist does, because a fist he can answer and contempt he cannot. And I watched the town coat man's neck go red above his collar, and I watched the woman see it too, and something passed between us in that second that was the beginning of everything, though neither of us would have called it that. "His name's Del Prout," the woman said to me, conversational, nomming the town coat man like she was nomming a kind of weed. "He does Adler Coin's talking. Mr. Coin owns most of this valley now and means to own the rest, and the rest is mostly me, on account of I sit on the only place a man can cross the quartz between the latter hills and the rail survey. Mr. Prout comes by about once a month to tell me my husband's grave would rest easier if I sold. I tell him my husband's resting fine. We've got to know each other." "Sounds like it," I said. Prout gathered his reins. He was a man who knew when a moment had got away from him, I'll give him that. "You're making a mistake keeping on, Mrs. Lindley," he said, and the smile came back, but it had gone thin. "Mr. Coin's a patient man, but the valley's changing. The survey's coming through. There's going to be a lot of rough men in this country before the snow, working men, railroad men, and a widow alone at a river crossing well." He let it hang there, the way that kind always does, leaving you to build the threat yourself out of your own fear so his hands stay clean. "It's no place for a woman and 2 little ones. Think on it." "I think on it every day," she said, "and the answer's the same." Prout looked at me one more time, taking my measure, filing me away under some heading like nuisance or fool, and I let him, because being filed wrong was the work of my whole life by then. Then he turned his horse and the 2 hired men turned theirs, and they rode off east toward the survey camp and the town, and the dust hung over the road a while after them and then settled, and it was just the woman and me and the horses and the green low river. She closed the shotgun with a snap and let the hammer down careful and leaned it against the porch post like a broom she was done sweeping with. Then she looked at me, and now that the others were gone she let me see that she had been afraid, a little after all, not of me, but of how close the thing had come, and she let me see it on purpose, I think, as a kind of test, to learn what I'd do with a woman's fear once I'd seen it. What I did was nothing. I swung down off the mare and started loosening her cinch like I'd been hired an hour ago, which by then I supposed I had. "Where do you water?" I said. Something in her shoulders came down half an inch. "Tank's behind the barn," she said. "Pump stiff, you have to know it." She watched me a moment more. "You didn't ask what I pay." "Figured you'd tell me when you decided whether to keep me," I said. That got the first thing out of her that wasn't armor, not a smile. She wasn't a woman who spent smiles cheap, but a kind of easing around the eyes, a look a person gives you when they've decided, against their own better sense, to hope a little. "I'm Cora Lindley," she said. "Asag Greer," I told her, and it was the name I'd been using for years, plain as a fence rail, and she took it and didn't reach behind it, and I was grateful, because there was a great deal behind it, and none of it was anything I wanted her to know. That was how I came to the Lindley Crossing. I have gone over it 1,000 times in the years since, that first quarter hour, and I have never been able to find the place where I might have done different and ridden on. I think the truth is there was no such place. I think some doors are only a door once you've already walked through them. The crossing was a hard thing she was holding, and I saw how hard inside the first week. Her husband had been Henry Lindley, dead 2 years of a fever that took him in 9 days. And before that they'd built the place up from a single dugout and a rope ferry into a real crossing, a ford graded and stoned, so a wagon could take it dry most of the year, a corral and a barn, a string of good horses they bred and broke and sold or rented to folks who'd worn theirs out on the long dry road down from the latter hills. People crossing the quartz stopped at the Lindley place to rest, to water, to swap a spent animal for a fresh one, to buy a meal off Cora and a feed of grain off the barn, and in a good year it was a living and a little more. Henry had meant it to be a town someday. He'd been the kind of man, I gathered, who saw the town in the empty road the way some men see the oak in the acorn. Then he died, and the same year Adler coin came into the valley. I had never met the man yet, but I'd already met the shape of him, the way you meet the shape of a flood by the rack it leaves in the trees. Coin had come with money from someplace east, and a notion that the Quartz River Valley was going to be worth a great deal once the rail survey ran a line through it, which it was, and he had set about owning every foot of it before the rest of the world caught up to what he knew. He bought low where he could. Where a man wouldn't sell low, Coin found ways to lower his price for him. A fence cut, a water hole fouled, a note called in at the bank he half owned, a hand frightened off, a fire. By the time I rode and he'd bought or broken most of the small holders along the river, and the ones left were leaving, loading their wagons and pulling out for country where a man's deed still meant something. And every one of them had to cross the Quartz to leave, and the only place to cross was Cora Lindley's ford. That was why he wanted it. It wasn't the grass and it wasn't only the water. It was that whoever held the crossing held the throat of the whole valley. A railroad has to cross a river somewhere, and the somewhere is worth a fortune, and the survey was running its line straight at the Lindley Ford because the Lindley Ford was the only sane place to bridge the Quartz for 40 miles. Henry had known it. Cora knew it. Coin knew it. The crossing wasn't a horse ranch and a sod barn. It was the one card in the valley worth holding, and a widow was holding it, and she would not let it go. I learned all this in pieces, some from her and more from the country itself and from the few neighbors still hanging on, and I learned it while I worked, because I had hired on to work and I meant to do it. I fixed the pump. I reset the barn door that had dropped on its hinges. I went down the corral and found the 3 places the wire had been cut and badly mended, and I mended them right, and I didn't say anything about who'd cut them, and neither did she. But she watched me find all 3 without being told, and I felt her watching, and I knew she was beginning to wonder about me, which was the one thing I didn't want and couldn't help. There were the 2 children. I want to tell about them, because they are most of why I'm not the man I was. The boy was Toby, 11 that fall, all elbows and seriousness, carrying the weight of being the man of a place that no 11-year-old should have to be the man of. He'd taken Henry's death and turned it into a kind of grim industry. He was up before me most mornings, hauling water, throwing feed, doing a boy's chores and half a man's besides, and he watched me the first week the way a dog watches a stranger near its people, ready to fly at me if I gave him cause. I didn't give him cause. I gave him a job instead. Second morning I handed him the off end of a green colt's lead and showed him how to stand so the colt would read calm off him, and I watched him forget, for about 10 minutes, that he was supposed to be guarding the place against me and just be a boy with a horse. And I thought, well, there's one thing I can do here that's worth doing. The girl was Etta, 7, and she had decided about me inside of 2 days the way small children do, on no evidence at all, and the evidence she decided on was that I was hers. She followed me at a distance that grew shorter every day. She asked me the names of things and then told me I had them wrong. She informed me one evening gravely that the gray gelding was named Biscuit, and that Biscuit was sad because nobody talked to him, and would I talk to him, and I said I would, and after that she'd appear at my elbow at odd hours to make sure I was keeping my word to a horse. I had spent 12 years arranging my life so that no small person would ever depend on me again. I did not know how to tell a 7-year-old to stop, and I found to my own alarm that I did not want to. And there was Cora. I'd best tell about Cora plain because everything turns on her, and because she would not thank me for making her sound like a thing that needed saving, when the truth is she was the one doing the saving most of that fall, and I was only the one who came to stand beside her at the end of it. She was not a soft woman and she was not a hard one. She was a woman who had been left a hard thing to do and had simply set about doing it, day on day, without any fuss about how unfair it was, and that is a rarer and finer thing than people give it credit for. She ran the crossing. She kept the books, in a tight, clean hand in a ledger she balanced every Sunday. She knew horses better than I did in some ways. She could look at a wind-broke nag a stranger was trying to pass off as sound, and tell you its whole sad history in one glance. She cooked for travelers and charged them fair, and not a penny less than fair. And she raised those two children to be honest and unafraid in a valley that was trying its level best to teach them otherwise. She wore Henry's coat when it was cold because it was a good coat, and there was no sense letting it go to waste. And she carried her grief the way she carried everything, folded up small and put where it wouldn't trip anybody. I fell in love with her so slowly that I never once felt myself falling, the way you don't feel the road climbing until you look back and see how far below you the valley floor has got. I would not have allowed myself to fall if I'd felt it. I had no business loving anybody. But it crept up on me through 100 small doors, the way she said grace short and meant it, the way she laughed once, surprised out of herself, when the colt dumped me in the dust the third week, the way she sat on the porch in the blue evening after the children were down and didn't talk and didn't need me to, and let me sit there too, the two of us watching the river take the last light, two people who'd each lost the thing they'd built their life around, not saying so, just sitting where the other one could be felt. The first real blow came in October, and it came at night, the way that kind of thing always does, because the men who do it haven't the nerve for daylight. I woke to the mare screaming in the corral and the red light moving on the bunkroom wall, and I was out the door pulling my boots on before I was rightly awake, and the hay barn, the little second barn down by the river where Cora kept the cut hay against the winter, was burning. It had gone up fast the way dry hay does, a column of fire standing up off the river in the black night, throwing its light a quarter mile, and I knew before I reached it that there was no saving the hay. A man cannot fight a hay fire with a bucket. All you can do is keep it from taking the rest. So that's what we did, Cora and I and Toby, who came running in his nightshirt with a wet sack and would not be sent back no matter what his mother said. The three of us beating sparks off the corral rails and the barn roof and the dry grass while the little barn roared itself down to a heap of coals, and the horses ran the fence half mad with fear. It took us till near dawn. When it was over we were black to the elbows and scorched, and the hay was gone, 2 months of cutting, the winter feed for the whole string, and the three of us stood in the gray first light looking at the smoking pit of it, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Toby said, in a voice that was trying so hard to be a man's that it broke my heart, "It was them, wasn't it, Prout and them?" "We don't know that," Cora said. "We do," the boy said. "You know we do." And Cora didn't answer him, because he was right and she would not lie to him, and that was when I walked down to the river edge below the burned barn, where the grass was trampled, and I found what I knew I'd find. 2 horses had stood there in the night. The ground was soft from the low river and the prints were good and clear, and one of the horses had a bar shoe on the off fore, the kind a smith puts on to carry a horse with a bad hoof, and I stood looking at that bar shoe print a long while. I want to tell you what went through me, looking at that print, because it's the center of the whole thing. What went through me was not fear and it was not grief. It was an old, cold, familiar quiet, like a draft coming up out of a cellar I'd nailed shut years ago. Because there had been a time in my life when a print like that was a beginning, when I'd have followed it to whatever barn that bar-shod horse was stalled in, and found the man who rode it, and the man would have known me, and it would have ended one way. There had been a time when men like Del Prout, and whoever held Adler Coyne's leash crossed the country wide to avoid the place I happened to be, because of what I was and what I would do, and they were right too. I had buried that man. I'd buried him in a town called Calder Forks 12 years back, on the worst night of my life, and I had sworn on the only thing I had left to swear on that I would never dig him up again, not for any cause, not for any provocation, because I had learned what he cost, and the cost was more than I would ever again ask the world to pay. I'll have to tell about Calder Forks before this is done. Not yet, but I'll set this down here so you understand the size of what that bar shoe print woke in me, standing by a burned barn at dawn with a black-handed widow and her son behind me. I knew exactly what I was capable of, and I had spent 12 years making sure nobody else ever found out. And now here was a print in the mud and a fire at my back, and a woman I had no business loving and her 2 children, and the cold draft coming up out of the nailed-shut cellar saying, low and reasonable, the way it always spoke, "You know how to end this. You have always known." I covered the print with my boot. I don't know why. I think I didn't want her to see me see it. Then I went back up the bank. "Hay's gone," I said, "but the horses are sound and the barns and the house are saved. We'll get the string through the winter. I'll start cutting wild hay up the draws today. There's grass cured on the stem up in the ladder benches if a man's willing to climb for it. It'll be hard feed, but it'll do." Cora looked at me. She had soot on her face and her hair was down, and there was something in the way she looked at me that morning that was different from before, and I understood it later though I didn't then. She had seen, in the dark by the fire, that I didn't move like a hired hand. A hired hand fights a fire scared. I'd fought it cold, giving orders without knowing I was giving them, putting the boy where the boy would be safe and the line would hold, reading the fire the way I read everything, for where it would go and how to get ahead of it. She'd seen that. She didn't say anything about it, but she'd seen it and she filed it, the way I'd watched her file Prout's redneck the first day, and I knew this woman well enough by now to know that she missed very little and forgot nothing. "Why are you still here?" she said. It wasn't unkind. It was the truest question she had. "A hand who hires on at a crossing the month before Adler coin means to take it," she said, "is either a fool who doesn't know what he's walked into or he knew and came anyway. You're not a fool, Mr. Greer. I've watched you a month. So which is it, and what is it you came for?" And there it was, the question I'd been ducking, asked straight across a heap of burned hay with her children listening, and I owed her an answer because she'd asked it honest and she'd earned it. But I couldn't give her the true one. The true one was 12 years in a town called Calder Forks and a younger brother in the ground, and it was not a thing I could lay on a woman who had enough to carry. So I gave her the next truest thing, which was the most I'd said about myself to anybody in a long while. "I came for the work," I said. "That part's true, and I stayed because—" I stopped. Etta had come down from the house, small and grave in her nightgown, and put her hand in my black hand without a word, the way she did, and stood there leaning on my arm and looking at the smoking barn, and I had to wait a second before I could go on. "Because somewhere back along the road," I said, "I did a poor job of looking after some people who were mine to look after. And I find I haven't got it in me to ride past it happening again. That's all. That's the whole of what I can tell you. The rest is mine, and I'd ask you to leave it lay." She looked at me a long moment, and at the child holding my hand, and I watched her decide to leave it lay. "All right," she said. "Then you'd best know what you've stayed for." And she told me the thing she hadn't told me yet, the thing that changed it from a squeeze into a war. The bank note. Henry had borrowed against the place to grade the ford and build the corrals in the good years from the bank in Sumner's Crossing, the bank that Adler Coin had since bought a controlling share of. The note had 2 years to run when Henry died. It had a few months left now. And the terms, which had been ordinary terms when Henry signed them, had a clause in them that any banker writes and no honest one ever invokes, that the note could be called in full on 30 days' demand at the holder's discretion. Coin hadn't called it. He hadn't needed to. He'd been waiting, letting the fear do his work, expecting her to break and sell and save him the trouble. But the fire told me and told her that his patience was wearing through. The next step, when the squeezing didn't work, was the note. Call it, give her 30 days she couldn't possibly meet, and take the crossing clean and legal on the bank's paper while the law tipped its hat. "How much is owed?" I asked. She told me. It was a sum a working man could not earn in 3 years, let alone 30 days, and we both knew it, and we stood there with the number between us in the gray light. "Then we don't let it come to the note," I said. "We make the squeeze cost him more than the crossing's worth to him. A man like Coin does sums. Everything he does is a sum. We make the sum come out wrong." "How?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true. "But burning your hay was him telling us he's in a hurry. A man in a hurry makes mistakes. We're going to make him hurry more, and then we're going to be standing on the mistake when he makes it." I looked at her. "You've been holding this alone for 2 years, and you've held it. You're not alone now. That's all that's changed, but it's not nothing." I don't know that she believed me. I'm not sure I believed myself. But Etta squeezed my hand, and Toby came and stood by his mother with the wet sack still in his fist like he'd fight the whole valley with it. And Cora looked at the three of us, her 2 children and the strange closed man who'd hired on a month ago, and something in her settled, and she nodded once. "All right, Mr. Greer," she said. "We'll make the sum come out wrong." We had 6 weeks, near as I could reckon it, before the note's term ran and Coin could call it. 6 weeks to make holding the crossing cost him more than taking it would gain him. And the first thing I did with those 6 weeks was the thing I should have done my whole life and had been too much a coward to do. I went to the neighbors. There weren't many left. That was Coin's doing. He'd thinned them on purpose, because scattered people are weak and gathered people are not, and he'd made sure they stayed scattered, each family alone with its own fear, each one believing it was the only one still holding out, and that holding out was hopeless. That was the real trick of him I came to see. Not the fire and not the guns. The loneliness. He'd made 40 families each feel like the last one. So Cora and I rode the valley those first 2 weeks, and we did a simple thing that turned out to be the most dangerous thing we could have done, more dangerous than any gun. We let them see they weren't alone. There was old Matthias Webb, up the North Fork, who'd buried a wife and meant to be buried himself on his own ground and had told Coin so to his face. There were the Salters, a young couple with a baby and a quarter section of good bottomland, scared near to leaving. There was Reuben Vance, a freedman who'd come west after the war and proved up a hard, dry claim on the South Bench by main strength and would not be moved, and who'd had his fences cut and his well fouled twice for his trouble. There was the widow Asher and her grown son. There was a scatter of others, a dozen families in all, each one sitting alone in the dark of its own holding, believing the fight was already lost. We brought them together. We did it slow and quiet, a visit at a time, because we knew Coin had eyes. And the thing we told them was the thing I'd worked out by the burned barn, the only true thing I had, that the crossing was the key to all of it. That Coin needed the ford for the railroad, that the railroad was why the whole valley had got suddenly worth killing for. And that if the crossing held, if Cora did not sell and could not be made to sell, then Coin's whole scheme had a wall through the middle of it, because you cannot run a railroad up to a river and stop. As long as the Lindley Ford stayed in honest hands, every acre Coin had bought and bled for was worth a fraction of what he'd paid, because he couldn't get the rails across the water. The crossing wasn't just Cora's last stand. It was everybody's. I watched that land on them, one family at a time. I watched Matthias Webb's old eyes sharpen. I watched Reuben Vance, who trusted no white man and had good reason not to, look at me a long hard while and then look at Cora and decide to trust her, which was almost as good. I watched the scared young Salter husband stop looking at the floor, because it changed the shape of the thing for them. They'd each thought they were holding out alone for pride, for a grave, for stubbornness, against a tide that would take them anyhow. Now they saw they were holding one line together, and that the line had a hinge, and that the hinge could hold. "He's been telling each of us we're the only one left," Reuben Vance said, at the one gathering we risked. A dozen families crowded into Cora's main room on a moonless night with the horses hid in the draw. "Telling me my neighbor's already sold and took his money and I'm a fool holding on. Telling me I got no friends in this valley." He looked around the crowded room, at the faces of the people Coin had told him had abandoned him, all of them sitting right there. "Reckon he lied," he said. "He lied," said Matthias Webb. That was the night the valley stopped being 40 frightened families and started being one thing with a spine. And I'd done it by talking, by riding from door to door and saying true words, by standing people next to each other so they could see they weren't alone, And the cold draft from the cellar was quiet through all of it, because this was a thing the buried man could not have done. The buried man knew one tool. The buried man would have ridden out one night and found the bar-shod horse and ended a man, and another would have come, and another, because that's the arithmetic of the gun, it never finishes, it only takes turns. The thing we were building couldn't be ended by ending one man. You can kill a gunman. You can't shoot a valley that's decided to stand together. I was learning, slow and late, that there were powers in the world stronger than the one I'd buried, and I was learning it from a widow and a freedman and an old man who wanted to die on his own grass. But Coin was learning too. He was learning that the squeeze had stopped working, that the families weren't breaking the way they had, that something had changed at the crossing. And a man whose sums have started coming out wrong gets dangerous, the way I'd promised Cora he would. I just hadn't reckoned how fast or how he'd aim it. They beat him near to death on the Sumner's Crossing Road on a Saturday, 3 of them, and left him in the ditch with his wagon tipped and his week's goods scattered in the dust, and they did it in daylight on the public road, which was the message. The fire had been done at night by men with no nerve for the light. This was done at noon, where folks could see, and the seeing was the point. Coin had decided the time for hiding his hand was past. He wanted the valley to know what standing together would cost, and he'd chosen Reuben to teach it, because he reckoned a freedman was the one the rest would be quickest to abandon. And that was the second worst mistake Adler Coin made, because he'd read the old valley right and the new one wrong. We brought Reuben to the crossing. Cora wouldn't hear of anywhere else. Her place had the only good well, and she was the nearest thing the valley had to a doctor since the real one had been frightened off to the rail town. She set his arm and stitched his scalp and sat up 2 nights with the fever, and the Salter girl came and helped her, and Matthias Webb sat on the porch with his old buffalo gun across his knees those 2 nights without being asked, and the widow Asher's son brought down what Reuben's scattered goods could be gathered, and not one family that Coin had counted on to scatter scattered. They closed up instead. They closed up around the hurt man like a hand closing, and I stood in the dooryard the second night and watched the lamps burning in the windows of a house full of people who decided not to be afraid anymore. And I felt the cold draft from the cellar so strong I had to walk down to the river to be away from it. Because I knew who'd done it. Of course I knew. The bar-shod horse had been there on the road I'd ridden out and read the ground before they'd thought to brush it, and there it was, the same off-4-bar shoe from the night of the fire and 2 others, and I knew if I followed it I'd find a man, and I knew what I could do to that man. And standing by the Black River that night, I wanted to do it more than I had wanted anything in 12 years. Reuben Vance was a better man than I'd ever be, and they'd left him in a ditch for the crime of proving up dry ground while not being white, and the man who'd held the bar-shod horse was sleeping warm somewhere in Coin's pay, and I knew the trade. I had always known the trade. The cold draft told me, reasonable as ever, one night. You ride out, you settle it. The beatings stop because every man Coin hires learns that the crossing is a place you do not touch. You've done it before. You were good at it. You could keep these people safe. And I stood there a long time on the edge of doing it, and what kept me out of the saddle in the end was Calder Forks. I owe it to the telling to lay it down now, because it's the hinge of me, and without it none of what I did or didn't do makes sense. 12 years before, in a Kansas town called Calder Forks, I had been a man with a star on my coat and a name that traveled ahead of me. I won't dress it up. I was good with a gun in a country that needed men who were, and for a while I told myself that was a clean thing to be, that I stood between the weak and the men who'd prey on them, that the fear my name carried did honest work. And some of that was even true. But the gun is a tool that shapes the hand that holds it, and over years it had shaped mine, and I'd stopped being able to tell the difference between the men I faced to protect somebody, and the men I faced because facing men was the only language I had left. I'd grown proud. I'd grown sure. I'd come to believe that I could hold any trouble off the people I loved simply by being more dangerous than the trouble. I had a younger brother, Cole. He was 19 and he thought the sun rose on me, which was the worst thing about it because he tried to be me. And one night a feud I had made with my pride and my sureness and my unwillingness to walk away from a hard man who'd pushed me came to my door, and it was Cole who answered it because he wanted to stand where I stood. And he wasn't me. He was a boy playing at being me, and the men I'd made my enemies didn't care about the difference. And I came around the corner of the street 1 second too late. 1 second. Close enough to see his face and not close enough to do anything but watch. And they killed him in the dust of a town I was supposed to be keeping safe, for the crime of being my brother. That is what the gun cost me. Not a wound to myself. I'd have paid that gladly. It cost me the one person I'd have died to protect, and it cost him for nothing because of who I'd made myself. Because the dangerous man I'd become drew dangerous men the way carrion draws crows, and the people standing near me paid the price of my danger and not me. That was the lesson, and I learned it kneeling in the street with Cole's head in my lap. The most dangerous man in the valley is not a wall around the people he loves. He is a target painted over their lives. The very thing I'd thought kept them safe was the thing that got my brother killed. So I buried that man in Calder Forks. I took off the star and I put up the gun, not as a thing I'd never carry. A man crossing this country unarmed is a fool, but as a thing I would never again be. I swore I would never again be the most dangerous man in any place I stood, never again let my danger be the reason trouble came, never again let the people near me pay for what I was. I'd be nobody, a pair of hands. And I'd kept it 12 years, across half the territories, and it had cost me every friendship and every home I might have made, because you cannot be nobody and also be loved, and I'd thought that was the bargain and I'd paid it. And now I stood by the quartz river with all of it dug up raw, because a good man lay broken in the house behind me, and the trade was right there to make. And the only thing that kept me out of the saddle was the cold, clear knowledge that if I rode out and did what the buried man did, I would not be saving these people. I would be doing to them what I'd done to Cole. I'd be painting the target. I'd be making the crossing the place where the most dangerous man in the territory lived, and dangerous men would come for that, the way they always came, and it would not be me who paid. It would be Toby who'd taken to walking like me. It would be Etta who held my hand. It would be Cora. The gun doesn't protect the people you love. It spends them. I had learned that in the most expensive school there is, and I would not enroll again, not even for Reuben Vance, not even for the rage that wanted out of me so bad that night that my hand ached with it. So I didn't ride out. I went back up to the house instead, and I sat on the porch by Matthias Webb in the dark, and after a while the old man said, not looking at me, "You've got the look of a man deciding whether to do something he'll answer for." "I did," I said. "I decided not to." He said. He was quiet a while. "My boy was a hot one," he said finally. "Wanted to go after Coyne's men with a rifle back in the spring before they run him off to Oregon for his own safety, which is why I'm here alone. I told him the same thing I expect you just told yourself. You can kill a man. You can't kill what's coming. Only thing that beats what's coming is enough folks standing in front of it that it can't get around." He patted the buffalo gun on his knees. "This here's just for tonight, for the door. Past tonight it's no use to anybody. The thing that wins is in that house." He nodded back at the lit windows, the people, the closed hand. "You know that or you'd be in the saddle. That's why I like you, Greer. You know the thing that wins." I didn't say anything. But I have thought about that old man's words more times than I can count in the years since. The thing that wins is in the house. He was right, and it took a man who'd lost as much as I had to know it, and I sat with him till the dawn came up gray over the latter hills and Reuben Vance's fever broke in the back room, and Cora came out to the porch worn through and told us he'd sleep now, he'd mend. And the three of us watched the light come up over a valley that had decided, finally, to stand. Reuben mended. It was slow, and he carried a stiffness in that arm the rest of his life, but he mended. And the day he could sit a horse again, he rode the whole valley himself, every holding to show his face, to show Coyne hadn't broken him, and that ride did more than any words of mine. A dozen families that had been afraid watched a beaten man get back on his horse and ride, and they were done being afraid. Fear is a thing you can only feel so long before it turns, if somebody shows you how, into something harder and more useful. Reuben showed them how. And in the weeks of his mending, while the note's clock ran down toward the day coin could call it, Cora and I built the thing that would actually win. And we built it at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a stub of pencil, which is a stranger place to win a frontier war than the street, but it's where this one was won. Here is what we worked out, the two of us, head to head over that ledger in the lamplight while the children slept. And I'll set it down because it's the part folks always leave out of these stories, and it's the part that mattered. The note could be called, yes, 30 days to pay the whole or forfeit the crossing to the bank. We could not pay the whole, but a called note is a legal instrument, and legal instruments run both directions, and Cora, who kept books, who read every paper she ever signed, who was nobody's fool, remembered something about Henry's note that coin had counted on everybody forgetting. The note was secured against the land and improvements at their assessed value. And the crossing had been assessed in the good years before coin came by an honest county assessor, at a fair price for a working horse ranch and ford, a price well above what was owed, which meant that if the bank called the note and took the crossing, the bank owed Cora the difference between the assessment and the debt. In cash. That's the law for a secured note, and coin, who'd written the calling clause to scare a widow, had not reckoned on the widow knowing the back of the same page he'd written the front of. It wasn't enough by itself. He could fight the assessment, drag it through a court he half owned, but it was a crack, and into that crack we drove a wedge, and the wedge was the railroad. Because here was the thing coin had built his whole scheme on and never said out loud. The value of everything he'd bought depended on the railroad coming through the Lindley Ford. He'd paid railroad prices for land that was worth dryland grazing prices without the rails. If the railroad didn't come, or came somewhere else, Adler Coin was not a rich man buying a valley. He was a fool holding a great deal of worthless dry grass on borrowed money, because he'd borrowed, too. A man buys a whole valley fast on his own cash only if he's a king, and Coin was no king. He was leveraged to the hilt against land that was only worth what he'd paid if the rails crossed at the ford. So I rode to the rail survey camp. Took me 2 days, and I did the second thing I'd buried the gunman to be able to do. I talked to honest men honestly. I found the survey chief, an engineer named Hollies, a sober, careful man with mud on his boots and a transit on his shoulder, and I laid it out for him plain. Not threats, facts. I told him the only sane crossing of the quartz for 40 miles was the Lindley Ford. He already knew that. His own line ran straight at it. And then I told him the rest. That the ford was held by a widow Adler Coin was trying to break off it by fraud and fire and the beating of her neighbors. That the title was clouded by a note Coin meant to call by a trick. And that if the railroad bought right-of-way across that crossing from Adler Coin, it would be buying stolen ground. And the theft would come out, because the whole valley would testify to it. A dozen honest families and a freedman half killed on the public road. And a railroad does not want its bridge, standing on a title that a courtroom full of wronged homesteaders is going to spend 10 years suing over. "What is it you want, Mr. Greer?" Holly said when I was done. He was a careful man, like I said, and a fair one, and he'd been getting an uneasy feeling about the man who kept offering him the crossing, and I just confirmed it. "I want the railroad to buy its crossing honest," I said, "from the woman who honestly owns it. Pay her a fair price, the price the ground's worth to you, and you'll have a clean title no court can shake and a whole valley glad to see you instead of a whole valley in the witness box. Buy it from Coin and you'll spend more in lawyers in 5 years than the fair price 10 times over, and your bridge'll be a scandal. You're an engineer. You know which bridge stands. Build the one with the sound foundation." Hollies looked at me a long while. Then he asked me the question Cora had asked, the question everybody worth a damn eventually asked me. "Who are you, that you ride in here and argue a railroad's interest better than its own land agent?" 10:30 a.m. He didn't promise me anything that day. Careful men don't. But he wrote things down, and he asked the names of the families, and he said he'd ride the valley himself and see. And a careful, honest man who says he'll see is worth more than a dozen who promise, because when he's seen, he acts, and nothing turns him. I rode home knowing I'd done the most dangerous thing in my power, which was to make Adler Coin's whole scheme depend on a railroad that had just learned the truth. What I did not know, riding home, was that Coin had learned I'd been to the survey camp before I was halfway back, because Coin had a man in the survey camp, of course he did, and that this was the thing, not the gathering, not the ledger, not even Reuben's defiant ride, that finally told Adler Coin he was losing. A frightened valley he could squeeze for years. But a valley that had got to the railroad, that had turned his own buyer against him, that had found the crack in his sums, that he had to end now, fast, before Holly's finished riding the valley and the truth set like concrete. He had days, and he knew it, and a cornered man who's leveraged to the hilt and watching it all come apart does the thing such men always do at the end. He stopped being patient and clever and reached for the gun, because the gun was the only move he had left, and he'd always had it in reserve, and he sent for the only kind of man who could make the crossing his by sundown. He sent for the Hagen brothers. I knew the name before Prout ever said it. And that's the bitter joke at the bottom of all this, the thing I have never told anybody but will set down here because the telling's no good if it's not complete. I knew the Hagens, from before, from the life I'd buried. View Hagen and his brother Law were guns for hire out of the Southern Territories, and they'd been guns for hire 12 years back too, when I was the Law, and our paths had crossed in the way such paths cross, and the way it had ended was that they had learned, the hard way, the cost of facing the man I used to be, and had been careful ever since to be in another county when that man was around. They did not know a Sagreer the hired hand. But they had known the man I'd buried in Calder Forks, known him well enough to cross the territory wide to avoid him, and when Prout rode out to the crossing 2 days before the note came due and told Cora, smiling that thin smile, that Mr. Coin has engaged some professional gentleman to oversee the transfer of the property, the Hagen brothers. Perhaps you've heard the name. They'll be by Thursday to take possession. When Prout said that name, the cold cellar door I'd nailed shut 12 years ago did not just leak a draft, it blew open. Because here was the trap the whole thing had walked me into, the trap I'd felt closing since the first Barshoe print and had been praying to avoid. Everything I'd built, the gathering, the ledger, the railroad, the slow, honest, patient war to beat Coin with law and numbers and a valley standing together, all of it needed a few more days. Holly's needed to finish his ride. The note needed to be met by the assessment counterclaim in a courtroom. The honest way was working, but it was working on the clock of law and reason, and Adler Coin had just thrown that clock out the window and sent 2 killers to take the crossing by Thursday morning. And against 2 killers on Thursday morning, a ledger is no use, and a railroad survey is no use, and a valley of brave farmers with squirrel guns is worse than no use, because brave farmers against the Hagen brothers is just more graves. There was one thing on this earth that could stop View and Lal Hagen from taking the Lindley crossing on Thursday morning, and I was it. And I was it only if I dug up the man I'd swum never to be again. I sat up the whole night before, alone, down by the river where the burned barn had been, and I had it out with myself, and I'll tell it true because a man shouldn't pretty up the worst hour of his life. Everything in me that had learned the lesson of Calder Forks said, do not become the dangerous man again. You know what he costs. You know that the moment you stand in that street as the man the Hagens fear, you have painted the target, you have made the crossing the place where that man lives, and even if you win Thursday, you have lost the only thing that matters, which is a home where danger does not come because of you. You buried him to keep the people near you safe. Dig him up and you'll spend Toby and Etta and Cora the way you spent Cole. And everything else in me, everything that had grown that fall in the company of that woman and those children, said back, quiet and certain, You are not the man you were in Calder Forks. The man in Calder Forks dug up his danger out of pride, to win, to be the most dangerous man in the valley because he could not stand to be anything less. That man got Cole killed because the danger was for himself. But there is another way to pick up a thing you've laid down. You can pick it up not to be dangerous, but to be a wall once for as long as it takes, and then lay it down again. The lesson of Calder Forks was never that the gun is always wrong. The lesson was that the gun is always wrong when you carry it for yourself. Carry it for them, and only as far as them, and lay it down the instant they're safe, and you are not that man. You are something he never managed to be. The difference is everything. It is the whole difference between a man and the thing I'd been. And by the gray of the morning I had found it, the narrow path between the two cowardices. The cowardice of riding out to kill in the night, and the cowardice of standing by while two killers took everything from a woman I loved, because I was too afraid of my own hands to use them once, cleanly, in the light, as a shield and not a sword. I would meet the Hoggins, but I would meet them my new way and not my old one. I would not ride out to find them in the dark. I would stand in the open street of Sumner's Crossing in the full light of Thursday morning, in front of the whole valley and the law and God, and I would give them the one thing that had always, with the Hoggins, been enough: the truth of who they were facing. And I would do everything in my power to make it end without a shot, because the measure of the new man was not whether he could kill the Hoggins. The buried man could do that, but whether he could stop them without it, whether he could pick up all that danger and use it as a word instead of a bullet, and then set it down forever. I told Cora at dawn. She had a right to know, and I would not do a great thing in her name without her leave. I told her more than I'd told anyone, not all of Calder Forks, but enough. That I had been a different man, a lawman, a feared one, that I'd buried him for a reason that cost me my brother, and that the Hoggins knew that man, and that I meant to stand up as him one last time Thursday in the street, to turn them, and then bury him again for good. She was quiet a long while when I'd done. Then she said the thing that told me I'd been right to love her. She didn't say don't, and she didn't say I'm afraid, though she was, and she didn't say be careful. She looked at me with those steady eyes and she said, "And after, when it's done and they're turned and the crossing safe, can you set him down again, truly, or will you have liked it too much?" Because she'd understood. She'd understood the real danger faster than I had, the danger that wasn't the Hoggins at all. The danger that a man who picks up the thing he was might find he wants to keep it. That's what had happened the first time in the years before Calder Forks. I'd picked up the danger for good reasons and then learned to like being dangerous, and the liking had killed Cole. And Cora, who had known me 3 months, had seen straight to the center of it and asked the only question that mattered. "I don't know," I told her, because I would not lie to her. "I believe I can. I've buried him 12 years and never missed him once, and I won't miss him after because I know now what he is. But you're right to ask, and I'll tell you how you'll know. If I set him down, if Thursday's the last of it, and I never pick it up again no matter what comes, then you'll know I'm the man I hope I am. And if I don't, if I find reasons to keep being him, then you were right to ask, and you should send me down the road, because a man who likes it is a danger to you and the children, no matter how good his reasons sound." I took her hand, first time I'd done it. "I'd rather you held me to that," I said, "than loved me blind. Hold me to it." She held my hand, and she held me to it both, for the rest of our lives, and there was never a finer thing done for me than that holding. Thursday morning I rode into Sumner's Crossing alone, in the front of everybody, which was the whole point. I'd sent word through the valley the night before, and the valley had come not to fight. I'd been plain about that. There'd be no farmers with squirrel guns in this. That was the surest way to get good men killed. They'd come to witness. That was the weapon. A dozen families and the survey chief Hollies, who'd finished his ride and seen what there was to see, and the county sheriff from the seat 2 days off, whom Hollies had sent for in the railroad's name, because a railroad's word moves a sheriff that a widow's can't, all of them in the street, and on the walks of Sumner's Crossing in the cold, bright morning. so that whatever happened would happen in front of the law and the railroad and the whole watching valley in the daylight, where Adler Coin's hand could not stay clean, and the Hagen's work could not be done quiet. That was the trap I'd built for two killers and the man who'd hired them. I'd made the street the worst possible place in the world for them to do murder, and I'd made sure they had to do it there or not at all. The Hagens were in front of the bank when I came up the street, the two of them and Prout near them, and Adler Coin himself on the bank steps, a soft, heavy man in a good coat, soft the way men get who hire their hardness done, watching his property get taken with a banker's patience. I saw the Hagen see me. I saw the moment. View Hagen had a face like a cut of dried beef. And I watched it go from the flat readiness of a man expecting some farmer or some local hired tough, to something else entirely, when I got close enough to be a face and not a shape. I watched him know me. I watched 12 years fall away off his eyes and the old name come up behind them, and I watched him go still in a way that had nothing of the gunfighter's coiled readiness in it, and everything of a man who has just seen the one thing on the road he'd crossed 3 counties to never see again. I stopped in the middle of the street, easy, my hands plain, the way I'd stopped in front of Prout that first day 3 months gone, and I spoke to View Hagen quiet. But the morning was still and the street was silent, and it carried to every soul there, which was the point. "Morning View," I said. "La'll been a long time." Nobody else in that street knew what passed in the next few seconds, but the Hagens knew, and Coin, watching his hired killers' faces, began to know that something had gone badly wrong with his son. "It can go the old way," I said, still quiet, still easy, my hands nowhere near my belt, because the whole art of it was that I didn't need them there and the Hagens knew I didn't. "You boys remember the old way, or it can go a new way, which is this. You get on your horses and you ride south, and you tell Mr. Coin his money's no good here, and nobody dies in this street today, and you live to spend what he's already paid you somewhere a long way off. I'm not the man who'd have ridden you down 12 years back. I put him away. I only dug him up this morning to say this one thing to you, and I'm going to put him away again the minute you turn your horses, and you'll never see him again. But he's here right now, View. He's standing in this street right now. You know him. You know what this morning costs if you make it the old way, so I'm asking you to make it the new way and live. I have stood in a great many streets in my life and faced a great many men, and I tell you the truest thing I know about it, the thing the storytellers always get wrong. The bravest and best thing a dangerous man can ever do is give the other man the road out and mean it, and the whole valley watched me do it. I wasn't there to kill the Hagens. I'd have given a great deal not to. I was there to be, for 90 seconds, undeniably the man they feared, so that I could hand them their lives and a way to keep them in front of witnesses, where Coin couldn't order them forward without ordering them to die.